Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third panel in our biannual research conference, Shall Not Be Denied, the 15th and 19th Amendments at the Sesquicentennial and Centennial of their ratification. Today's panel is on the federal government, the states, and the empire. So the issue of suffrage and voting rights in those areas. Let me introduce our first presenter. Starting us off today with this wonderful panel is Professor Silvana Siddali. She teaches courses in 19th century American history at St. Louis University in Missouri. Her books include From Property to Person, Slavery and the Confiscation Acts, 1861 to 1862, Missouri's War, the Civil War in Documents, and Frontier Democracy, Constitutional Conventions in the Old Northwest. She is currently writing a book that compares mid-19th century European post-revolutionary constitutions with American post-Civil War state constitutions. Professor Siddali, welcome to the MHS.
Thank you so much. And I want to begin by thanking both you and Katie for all your hard work. This is the only conference that I get to attend this year, so I'm particularly grateful to you for bringing us together. So thank you. So the title to our panel and the presentation probably led you to believe that our papers look at governments, particularly the federal government, but I'm turning that upside down. My paper really begins from the ground up with American state constitutions. I'm especially interested in the relationship between state constitutions and the federal constitution, particularly in questions about rights and suffrage and the changing ideas about federalism. And that's what's always fascinated me about state constitutions, because they can shed a great light into how Americans change their thinking about constitutionalism on the ground, and sometimes year by year as you're looking at state constitutional debates and reactions to these constitutions. And especially, this is especially important after transformative events like the American Civil War. And of course, it's always a messy project that's fraught with terrible conflicts, confusions, and a lot of failures. And by failures specifically, I mean the failure to resolve problems inside the constitutions, the inability to achieve consensus, for example. A lot of these conventions, when they failed to resolve an important problem, punted it to state legislatures or to to referenda, citizen referenda. And of course, the ultimate failure is when the citizens failed to ratify these constitutions. And they had to start this whole messy, expensive project all over again. I'm looking at this project specifically in the new Western states that joined the Union before the Civil War, and to some degree also after. I'm looking at Michigan, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and in the northern tier of what today is considered the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Ohio just to the south and west of there from the 1830s through the 1870s. One of the questions I address here is actually a historiographic one. Historians have always assumed, generally assumed, not Professor Finkelman, by the way, have generally assumed that these constitutions failed due to an unwillingness to accept Black suffrage, that people revolted after the Reconstruction period and decided they couldn't deal with a state constitution that enshrined voting rights for Black men. And I agree that this is partly an answer, but the situation was much more complicated. And it's important to understand this in order to understand a deeper American commitment to other rights, such as, for example, property rights and the connection between civil rights and civic duties. That is addressed in more depth in my paper, and I won't get to it in this brief presentation. But the core question is, why did these states ratify the Reconstruction Amendments relatively quickly, especially the 15th Amendment, but struggled so much with rewriting their own state constitutions? And as I mentioned, these problems are particularly evident in the new Western states, where many of the problems of citizenship, suffrage, and federalism hadn't yet been resolved. And one takeaway, to cut to the chase, is that this proves that a federal constitutional amendment was necessary for the whole country, and not just for the southern states as they were attempting to rejoin the Union. These southern states had to ratify the Reconstruction Amendments. They had no choice. They wouldn't have been able to come back into the Union without that. And to some degree, the New England and Mid-Atlantic states already resolved that problem in their state constitutions, or at least addressed it on paper, if not in practice. So at the very least, they didn't have to revisit it for a while. But in the new Western states, this was all still wildly up for debate and engendered a lot of bitter arguments. I want to get you into the arena of the area and the time period that we're discussing. During the mid-19th century, more than 30,000 free African Americans settled north and west of the Ohio River. They bought federal lands there and built thriving communities, educated their children, and occasionally even voted in elections. At the same time, they experienced serious racial discrimination, segregation, and even anti-Black violence. And no state in the region extended suffrage to Black people before 1868. Throughout the Civil War era, though, Black civil rights activists and their white allies fought tirelessly to foreground constitutional principles in debates over civil rights. They did that through writing petitions to state legislatures and to state constitutional conventions, editorials in newspapers, and of course in meeting in Black conventions. And as a result of this activism, white lawmakers who argued with each other about the rights of free Black people had to wrestle with these grave conflicts between, on the one hand, constitutionally protected rights of Black property owners, and on the other, their own perceived rights to live in a segregated society. And those confusions were not capable of resolution and therefore resulted in a series of constitutional failures. And at this point, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip over this discussion of property ownership and civil rights and duties and go right to the end. I want to look at the Reconstruction Amendments. As I said, right after the Civil War, most states in the Union did try to revise their state constitutions. All of the states in the Midwest did, and most of them failed, sometimes twice. Why did they fail? At least part of that had to do with the fact that they were trying to transform their states. They understood that something immense had happened to interpretations of the US Constitution, but they didn't know how to make these changes on the ground. They simply failed to envision something larger, and they ended up trying to jam old, outdated, outworn antebellum solutions into the post-Civil War era. For example, things like pre-war democratic enmity to banks, so they tried to enshrine anti-bank resolutions, and that, of course, was never going to work after in this new world order. You had to have banks. Or, for example, messing around with state legislatures, changing the pay without really addressing the fundamental structure of who these legislatures would be, how they would work, how often they would meet. And as a result, the citizens rejected the constitutions quite resoundingly, in some cases by 2-to-1 margin. At the same time, the Midwestern states had no trouble ratifying the Reconstruction Amendments. The Midwestern state legislatures ratified the 13th and 14th Amendments by early 1867. What's more important is that by the spring of 1868, 3 of the states, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, expanded suffrage to Black voters months before ratifying the 15th Amendment. In fact, all of the Midwestern state legislatures ratified the 15th Amendment by the spring of 1869, and the last 2 by early 1870. Now, here's where the problem comes in. They didn't affirmatively desegregate, and they didn't actually change the definition of voters except to strike out the word white. Yes, that was in some ways a sea change, but it actually left open a door for bringing segregation, particularly in more personal and face-to-face relationships later on. For example, every Midwestern legislature passed laws desegregating public venues like public transportation, steamboats, railroads, theaters, restaurants. And in cases where African American citizens encountered discrimination, they sued. And they usually won those suits either immediately or on appeal. But that effort to just strike out the word white left in place laws that forbade marriage between people of different races and laws that allowed individual communities to segregate schools. And while all this is going on, the Republicans in the state legislatures also in Congress are backsliding. They're ceasing their efforts to protect Black citizens, partly in a way in the hopes of getting themselves reelected, and partly just out of exhaustion. And they had also achieved their goal of subduing the southern states by instituting these Reconstruction Amendments. So what's the takeaway from all this? Partly, yes, there was a history of white reluctance to expand voting rights. But that's not why these constitutions failed. The story is more complicated than that, and it does show how difficult it is to rebuild a society while expanding rights. And it's true. For white lawmakers, that effort was incomplete, halting, and often resulted in failures that ended up hurting Black Midwesterners for generations. But those disappointments and failures also show that lawmakers felt forced to keep trying, to keep working, to keep reforming. They didn't just throw in the towel. They attempted to rewrite laws and rewrite constitutions as much as they were able, given their own innate limitations. Of course, Black Midwesterners would have to wait another century before they achieved full equality, full social and political equality. Okay, thanks.
Moving on geographically to Oklahoma. And our presenter is Professor Sunu Kodumthara. She's an associate professor of history at Southwestern Oklahoma State University in Weatherford, Oklahoma. She's the author of The Right of Suffrage Has Been Thrust on Me, The Reluctant Suffragists of the American West, published in the October 2020 issue of the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Congratulations. She is also a contributing author to This Land is Her Land, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870s to the 2010s, which will be published in 2021 by the University of Oklahoma Press. Professor Kodumthara, welcome to the MHS.
Thank you so much, Kid, and thank you so much to the Massachusetts Historical Society for this extraordinary opportunity. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. This project actually started 6 years ago. I thought it would be a part of a larger project, and it turned out it was a large project on its own merits. It was something that happened as I was exploring through the Library of Congress, through the NASA collection. And so I want to show you what started for me. Let me start by sharing my screen. As I started looking through the NASA collection, I came across this particular treasure from the Oklahoma Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. This was an insert that they had created to include in newspapers across the state of Oklahoma. Now, it was much larger than this. This isn't even the entire top half of the insert. This is just a little bit of it. And it wasn't surprising to me, as I have been working with, at that point I had been working with anti-suffragist materials for a long time. So that's not what was shocking to me. What was surprising really was the kind of rhetoric they were using and how they were describing themselves. In several of the articles, these Oklahoma women were describing themselves as Southern, and they were describing Oklahoma men as Southern. And as an Oklahoman myself, I've lived here for most of my life. And as a Western historian, this is what sort of threw me off. Because Oklahoma, as I've studied it and as I've lived here, it's Western, it's Southwestern, but not really Southern, at least not how I've learned it. And so this description as Southern was really interesting to me, and especially because of the article that's included there at the bottom of the screen there on the left side. A Southern Woman Speaks Her Mind, which is an article written anonymously by a Georgia woman, so it says. But it's an article that's included in a lot of anti-suffragist newsletters. And the fact that these particular women, these Oklahoma anti-suffragists, chose to use it, in which this particular woman talks about the suffrage amendment and the 15th Amendment as both being forced amendments by the federal government, was particularly intriguing. In this same collection, I also found an editorial by the Oklahoma Attorney General in the in the late 19 teens, early 1920s, S.P. Freeling, in which he publishes or he writes these feelings about the 19th Amendment and compares it to the 15th. And he talks about how the great success of the Southern people against the 15th Amendment had been the fact that they were able to exercise their poll taxes and what he calls their educational laws, of course he means the literacy tests, to defeat the purpose of the 15th Amendment and, quote, maintain a white man's civilization. And then he talks about his fears of the 19th Amendment, that the South, as he says, can no longer protect itself by means of a poll tax or educational tests if the 19th Amendment is then ratified. So these two sources really stood out to me, because here are these Oklahomans who are using these very Southern arguments to try and protect themselves from the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And that's when I realized this was going to be a project all on its own. So when I continued my research in the Oklahoma State Archives, looking at Governor James Robertson's papers, I wanted to see what other kind of pressure he was facing. But this time I found different messages. This is a letter on the left side from the New Hampshire Equal Suffrage Association. And these people were describing Oklahoma as a Western state, and not just a Western state, but a progressive Western state. And as you can see from the quote at the bottom, the East has always looked upon the West and Middle West as a section which dared to try new progressive measures. The telegram on the right side of the screen is from the California governor, William Stevens, in which he says that both California and Nevada were calling for special sessions to ratify the amendment, and so were other Western states. And he calls on Robertson to do the same, call a special session to ratify the amendment. Join your Western brethren to do the same, as we're all doing the same thing. So now Oklahoma is not just a Western state, it's a progressive Western state, which is how I had learned about Oklahoma the entire time. What I realized was that ratifying the suffrage amendment wasn't just a question of ratification. What I understood was that it brought forward an entirely different issue. This was a question for Oklahoma about identity, political and social identity. Oklahomans had a choice here in this moment. Either embrace a progressive Western identity or embrace a fully Southern cultural identity. They could choose the modernity of the new century or embrace the old traditions of the previous century. And the thing about it is that there was evidence that Oklahomans had done both. They were both the progressive Westerners of the new century and the traditional Southerners of the previous century. So I wanted to show you in this brief presentation evidence of both, starting with a glimpse into the racial history of Oklahoma's past. Going all the way back to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, you can see the presence of enslaved peoples, right, in Indian territory, from the forced removal of southeastern tribes into Indian territory, and then right into the end of the Civil War, you have the establishment of all Black towns. Indian territory, if you ignore the existence here in this map of these twin territories, if you remove those lines and just see this as Indian territory, Indian territory itself represented the promised land of sorts, especially for newly freed peoples. And it was because it had promised all of these opportunities to freed peoples that other places did not allow them. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there was such a heavy prominent position for the Republican Party here. And that was true up until 1890. 1890 is when you have the establishment of the Twin Territories that we see there. With the establishment of the Twin Territories and the large influx of white populations into this area, you also have the influx of a Democratic presence. And with a Democratic presence in both the Oklahoma and Indian territories, but most especially in the Indian Territory, you start to also see more push for voter suppression, especially among now Black Americans. This voter suppression is going to change the political outlook of what these Twin Territories look like. And as a result, Republicans start to lose control. By the time you have the State Constitutional Convention in 1906, Republicans have very little control and Black Americans have very little influence, to the point where of the 112 delegates elected to the State Constitutional Convention, 99 of them are Democrats, including the man elected to serve as the convention's president. And that's the man pictured there in the center square, for lack of a better term. That is William Alfalfa Bill, that's his nickname, I can't make that up, William Alfalfa Bill Murray with the handlebar mustache. In his opening address to the convention, he decided to make it entirely about race. And one of his statements in his opening address is about how, as he puts it, the Black man was not capable of rising to the level of the white man. It's his opening address to the State Constitutional Convention, and he decides to make it entirely about race. So from the very beginning of the Constitution and the formation of the state's Constitution, they have made this about race. So clearly there is a message here about trying to embrace this what appears to be a very old Southern identity, a Southern cultural identity. Yet at the same time, at this very constitutional convention, there is a progressive atmosphere. There are farmers and workers represented here. There is an atmosphere that it needs to represent a community that is beneficial for the working class. And there is also the presence of this woman pictured here, Catherine Barnard, who, while she is not an elected delegate, is someone invited to speak here on behalf of the farmers and the workers. There is so much respect for her that there is an office created specifically for her, and that is the Commission of Charities and Corrections. And while she is not allowed to vote because women's suffrage is not passed at this particular convention, she is elected to the office, and she is elected with a greater plurality than anyone at the first election in the state's history. So there are hints of, and not just hints, there is a great political environment of progressive measures, as William Jennings Bryan will talk about, but there are also great indications of racism and segregation at the same time. So by the time you have any indication of women's suffrage in 1918, there is two messages coming out of the state of Oklahoma. You have a progressive state that wants to push for women's suffrage, that wants to push for a progressive message of women's rights, and at the same time, a traditional state that promotes this message of segregation, which is why you have these two groups of people pushing for this identity struggle. By the time Robertson makes his decision to call for a special session, it is all the way now February of 1920. And the question then becomes, well, why are we going to call for a special session now? And quite frankly, it's because I want to. That's his answer. Everyone in the Democratic Party essentially pressures him to say, it's time we call the special session. There's no point in waiting. We know what we want. It's time to vote in support of ratification. There's no doubt of how we stand. And so within less than a week, which is the shortest amount of time that the Oklahoma legislature goes into session, the Oklahoma Senate and legislature vote in favor of ratification. And on February 28th, Oklahoma becomes the 33rd state to vote in support of ratification. And as a result, Oklahoma also makes this message clear. Oklahoma is both progressive and traditional. They embrace both because that's exactly who Oklahoma is. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Wonderful. And now we are going to take a trip across the Pacific Ocean to see how all this plays out in the Philippines. And we're joined today in this final paper for this panel by Professor Laura Prieto. She is the Alumni Chair in Public Humanities and a Professor of History at Simmons University here in Boston. Harvard University Press published her first book, At Home in the Studio, The Professionalization of Women Artists in America. And she is also the co-editor with Stephen R. Berry and contributor to the new anthology, Crossings and Encounters, Race, Gender, and Sexualities in the Atlantic World. Her current scholarship studies colonizing and colonized women across the U.S. empire. She has written on transnational nurses, Protestant missionaries, anti-imperialists, and suffragists from the 1890s through the 1940s. Professor Prieto, welcome back to the MHS.
Thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society and also to Kid and Katie, as others have said, for organizing this conference and then reorganizing this conference in remote form so we could all take place. I'm honored to be here with my fellow panelists, and thank you all in the audience, because without you, this really wouldn't be a conference. So one of my main interests as a scholar has been tracing the histories of gender and race across U.S. empire in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. With the approach of the 19th Amendment Centennial, I wanted to look more closely at the women's suffrage movement across that empire, and it's a piece of that newer research that I'm talking about today. My title is a bit of a red herring because the 19th Amendment did not enfranchise any women in the Philippines, even though the Philippines was part of the United States in 1920 and continued to be so for over 2 decades afterwards. Yet, as my paper explores, the suffrage struggle of Filipino women was strongly connected to the movement on the US mainland. And the 19th Amendment had consequences for them, even if Filipinos and mainland Americans had very different relationships to federal power. First, a little background. This is more embedded and interwoven in the paper itself, but I wanted to start just reminding everyone of the fundamental tenet of suffrage rights in the United States, that you must be a citizen in order to vote. Citizenship does not, of course, guarantee voting rights by any means, but it is a prerequisite. And citizenship was exactly the thorny question at the heart of the status of these insular possessions, like the Philippines and Puerto Rico, that the United States acquired from Spain by the Treaty of Paris in 1899. It was also a question with territories that the US acquired overseas after that point. The federal government set up administration of each of these colonies separately. There were different organic acts. The federal government granted citizenship to each of these people in each of these colonies separately on different timetables and established democratic institutions gradually there, again, on different timelines in each colony. So it's quite a mosaic, complicated narrative. But in none of them did the US Constitution follow the flag, as the phrase went in the day. That is, the Constitution did not apply, the Bill of Rights did not apply, the amendments did not apply. There was a prevailing idea in the federal government and in the mainland United States that the peoples of these newly acquired territories needed civilizing first. They needed a period of tutelage before they would be ready for democracy. And some of you may know about a series of Supreme Court cases. They're referred to as the insular cases, decided from 1901 and forward, that decided or concluded that the inhabitants of these insular areas were not citizens of the United States at all. They were subjects of the United States. So making that very clear distinction. And therefore, each of these colonies did not follow the path through organized territory status to statehood as the Western territories had that joined the US before 1898. And of course, they still cannot vote for president and do not have elected representation in Congress, or voting representation in Congress. So American suffragists did not include American colonies on their maps of progress towards the 19th Amendment. And why should they have? The 19th Amendment wouldn't apply there and didn't apply there. What interested me is, as we've come to diversify and revise the story of women's suffrage as we know it, there's been very little consciousness of those geographic limits of the 19th Amendment and the fact that women of color in the US colonies also remained disenfranchised after 1920. My paper uses an individual person as a lens or as a vantage point through this to study women and voting rights under American colonial rule, and more particularly to ask how Filipino women conceptualized and worked towards their enfranchisement. Sophia Reyes de Vera was not the only Filipina suffragist by any means, but she was an important one, and her lived experience illuminates the significance of the mainland US suffrage movement to the Philippines. And this is particular because she was a trans-Pacific traveler, as I'll talk about. Filipino women consistently advocated for their right to vote as inseparable from Filipino sovereignty, from the sovereignty of their nation. Hence, de Vera, as you'll see, engaged with mainland women in the mainland suffrage movement before and after 1920. Her goal was twofold: to win support for Philippine independence and for Filipino women's suffrage. And it's that activism that reveals the transnational, colonial, and racial complexities of the suffrage movement at this time. Sophia Reyes was born in 1876 under Spanish colonial rule at a time when only about 10% of Filipino women were literate. Sophia graduated from a Catholic colegio in the town of Molo, which you see in this image. So she was as well educated as any other Filipino woman of her generation. And despite the very strongly domestic ideal of womanhood in Spanish colonial culture in the Philippines, she became a teacher like her father. She was about 20 years old when the Philippine Revolution began against Spain in 1896. And 3 years later, Spain was defeated, but the United States simply stepped in as the new colonial power in the Philippines. The United States then waged a war with over 200,000 Filipino casualties in order to retain its new Pacific possession. This unwelcome American colonization brought, of course, pressure to assimilate. Alongside expanded opportunities for women, that meant entering the professions for the first time, more access to higher education, and taking on a greater role in public life than they ever had before. Sophia Reyes balanced individual ambition with resistance to colonialism, as did many Filipino people of her generation. She learned fluent English, pursued a career, and joined a burgeoning women's club movement. In that role, she founded the Asociación Feminista Filipina, which was an organization bringing together both Filipina and American women in Manila. It engaged in numerous civic projects, from prison reform advocacy to maternal health campaigns. And Sophia continued this work in reform as a young wife and mother after marrying a young politician named Jaime de Vera. You'll see him in a couple slides. In 1912, Sophia helped form another group, the Society for the Advancement of Women, as it was first called. Like the AFF, a cross-racial group with bilingual records and publications, which worked much more directly than its predecessor for the vote. It sponsored a women's suffrage bill that year and another one in 1919. American suffragist Carrie Chapman Cat, in case you're wondering why she's on this slide, took credit for inspiring this organization when she and Dr. Aletta Jacobs, a Dutch suffragist, visited Manila, stopped in Manila on their world suffrage tour. And she almost certainly met de Vera while she was in Manila. It was a relationship that continued throughout this suffrage story. Cat's interest in the Philippines reflected American suffragists' increasing internationalism in this era. Mainland organizations like NASA were lobbying to use federal power in order to enfranchise colonized women. They urged Congress to pass laws granting equal rights to Filipino women and Filipino men. During the drafting then of the federal Jones Act in 1916 to expand self-government in the Philippines, pro-suffrage congressmen proposed including women's suffrage in the bill. But in the end, the Jones Act limited suffrage to male adults who were literate, paid taxes, or held property. They had to meet at least one of those three conditions and be male. Mainland suffragists took these defeats bitterly, focusing only on the implications for women. Ultimately, American suffragists saw Filipina women's rights as a means to lobby for their own. But the Jones Act did redefine suffrage citizenship and the structure of government in the Philippines, even if it didn't enfranchise women. So it was a step closer to sovereignty and independence. Until the Jones Act, the Governor General, the Supreme Court, and the Senate, the Philippine Senate, were all federally appointed positions. The Jones Act made both houses of the Philippine legislature into elected bodies, and it promised Philippine independence in the future. In the wake of these changes in government, Jaime de Vera was elected a resident commissioner, meaning he would represent the Philippines as a non-voting member of the House of Representatives in the US federal government. So he, Sophia, and their 4 children took up residence in Washington, D.C. in 1917. And it struck me that this was in the midst of the National Woman's Party's famous picketing campaign, wherein silent sentinels protested daily in front of the White House. By the end of June, those pickets started getting arrested and serving prison sentences. Sophia de Vera was very conscious of these protests. She witnessed them. She did not so much join the mainland movement as begin engaging with it once she was on the mainland. And in this, she had her husband's support and partnership. Both Sophia and Jaime joined other political officials and dignitaries on NASA's newly formed advisory council in 1918. Indeed, Sophia was the only wife who served on the council alongside of her spouse. While the advisors served a largely ceremonial role, the de Veras may have helped influence NASA to take a more serious view of colonized women's suffrage. At the next NASA meeting in 1919, the leadership formally recognized for the first time that there were existing suffrage organizations in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, in Hawaii and Cuba. And the mainland organization officially invited those suffrage groups to join NASA without having to pay dues. For her part, Sophia de Vera tapped into NASA to build a network of support, again, for Philippine autonomy as well as for Filipino women's suffrage. As she wrote to Emily Green Balk of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, quote, "The aspirations of my people to have freedom," close quote, accompanied her desire for women's equality. De Vera became, to quote one newspaper, a publicity bureau all in herself, a popular public speaker and writer introducing Americans into her homeland. So she served that cultural ambassador role very publicly. It was not just her husband. Her mission was to persuade the United States that Filipinos were not, quote, naked savages who eat dogs, close quote, but a civilized people who embraced modernity and by implication deserved national autonomy. She and a fellow Manila club woman, a white American librarian named Bessie Dwyer, collaborated on illustrated talks featuring color photographs of the Philippines projected by Stereopticon. And de Vera also wrote many newspaper articles like this one. De Vera did not mention Filipino women's suffrage explicitly in these addresses, and that was deliberate. She was not, after all, trying to galvanize Americans to enfranchise Filipino women. She wanted Filipino people to enfranchise Filipino women. She wanted her right to vote to accompany her nation's sovereignty. So her lectures and articles instead focused on educating the American public about Filipino women's accomplishments, civic, professional, intellectual, and historical accomplishments. Those themes, of course, mirrored arguments by mainland suffragists who talked about women's contributions to society and thus fitness for the full franchise. De Vera emphasized the extensive social welfare work being performed by literally hundreds of clubs, women's clubs in the Philippines. And she and Bessie Dwyer implicitly embodied the cross-racial ideal of which they were speaking. While she drew upon similarities with American women, de Vera made clear that Filipino women were not simply following in the footsteps of mainland women. She emphasized the cultural distinctiveness of Filipino womanhood, for whom home was still central in the place of modern progress. working for the vote through social housekeeping and the club movement reassured Filipino nationalists and anti-suffragists that women remained devoted to the family and to Filipino culture. Published photographs of De Vera and her family underlined these points. She conspicuously wore a terno, which is a traditional Filipino style of dress, and images of her 4 children with her identified her as a proud mother whose suffragism was compatible with a full domestic life. After ratification of the 19th Amendment, major suffrage organizations on the mainland turned their focus further outward, and De Vera seized that moment to bring her message onto a world stage. In 1921, she addressed the National Woman's Party's Victory Convention, not as a regular delegate, but as you can see from this clipping, she was part of the programs for women in foreign countries, which might seem like a strange classification for a woman from a US colony, not yet a foreign country. I wonder if this was a tacit recognition by the National Woman's Party of the Filipino claim to sovereignty, a kind of endorsement of that. And then after the end of Jaime's term as commissioner and their return to the Philippines, Sophia and other Filipino suffragists continued to participate in these international feminist networks, both Pan-American ones, like ones that the National Women's Party led, and also Pan-Pacific ones. So she had both sides. She, being part of the United States, she could be part of the Pan-American networks, and being from the Philippines, and she could participate in the Pan-Pacific. Meanwhile, the Philippine Women's Club movement led the call for suffrage with increasing explicitness in the 1920s and 1930s. When another bill to enfranchise women failed in the Philippine Assembly in 1926, De Vera invoked the threat of federal U.S. intervention to goad the Philippine legislature into action. It may not be a coincidence that Puerto Rican suffragists were pursuing that same tactic at that same time. The hostility of the press ebbed, and public hearings persuaded the Philippine legislature to support women's voting rights. After several delays, a bill passed both houses, and the Governor General signed it in 1933. It said that beginning on January 1st, 1935, female citizens of the Philippines would be able to vote in all elections on the same terms as men. But we're not done yet, because action by the US Congress inadvertently rendered this suffrage victory null. Before Filipino women could register to vote for an election, the federal Tidings-McDuffie Act, 1935, made the Philippines a commonwealth, again, one step closer to full independence, and called for a constitutional convention. That convention voted to reset suffrage as a privilege of male citizens alone. After some outcry, the convention conceded to hold a plebiscite on the matter. A minimum of 300,000 women would have to affirm their desire to have the vote before they would be granted it. Sophia Reyes de Vera and dozens of her fellow suffragists proceeded to lead the plebiscite campaign in 1936-37. They first needed to educate women about the process, for example, distributing sample ballots, and they needed to persuade enough women to vote yes, enough women to vote, and then enough of them to vote yes. Printing campaign legislature was especially costly given the number of languages in the archipelago. De Vera, Aurora Quezon, and Pilar Lim, president of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, turned to their old colleague, Carrie Chapman Cat. They persuaded Cat to work with NASA networks, to draw on NASA networks, and to raise money to support their campaign. In the end, the plebiscite passed with substantially more than the 300,000 necessary casting votes. By the final tally, about 500,000 Filipino women voted, and over 447,000 voted yes to affirm their desire for the equal franchise, so about 90% landslide. And full independence for the Philippines arrived in 1946, almost a decade after women's suffrage. So to conclude, the winning of the vote for women in the Philippines by the election law of 1937 was a product of both feminist imperialism and anti-colonial suffragism. It had a genealogical connection to the mainland women's suffrage movement in terms of relationships, ideas, exchanges. Filipina suffragists forged networks with mainland US suffragists, which proved important up through the very last days of their campaign. At the same time, Filipino women succeeded in asserting their movement as autonomous and distinct. De Vera and other suffragists made a dual case for their sovereignty as women citizens and Philippine citizens. Their right to vote was not a gift of colonization, but a testament to Filipino suffragists' skill in navigating empire on both sides of the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. All right, we now turn to the commentary. And to comment, we have Professor Paul Finkelman, also President Paul Finkelman of Gratz College. Before becoming president of Gratz in 2017, he taught in history departments and law schools at a number of universities, including Duke Law School, Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Texas. He was a scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia and a fellow in the Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism program at the University of Pennsylvania. He has published in a wide variety of subjects, including human rights, slavery and human trafficking, historically and modern, American Jewish history, American legal history, constitutional law, and legal issues surrounding baseball. Finkelman is the author of more than 200 scholarly articles and the author and editor of more than 50 books. In 2018, Harvard University Press published his book, Supreme Injustice: Slavery in the Nation's Highest Court. His most recent book is a new edition of Defending Slavery: Pro-Slavery Thought in the Old South, which came out last year. The U.S. Supreme Court has cited him in 5 decisions involving civil rights, affirmative action, and the Bill of Rights. Most recently, Justice Ginsburg quoted him in her opinion for a unanimous court in Timms v. Indiana in 2019. President Finkelman, welcome to the MHS.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society, which for a historian is one of the great institutions on the planet and a wonderful place to work, run by wonderful people. And I want to thank the 3 panelists for their papers. At one level, it's easy to theme these papers together because all of them have race running through them, some quite explicitly and some indirectly. A commentator, of course, can do a number of things, one of which is to theme the papers together. Another is to criticize the papers and to make suggestions on what they might do with them. I'm going to do a few of each of these. I start by saying that I like the papers a lot. I wrote to 2 of the panelists and asked them if they had books connected to the papers because I would love to see the books for a book series that I edit, one at the Ohio University Press and one at the University of Georgia Press, because the papers would fit in either one. And in some ways, that segues to Sunu's paper on Oklahoma. And because the question is Oklahoma a Midwestern state, a Western state, or a Southern state? And quite frankly, I think that Sunu drank the Kool-Aid too much when she was growing up in Oklahoma and got convinced that Oklahoma is a Western state. Let's look at Oklahoma in some detail. It is a territory when the Civil War begins, but it is the only territory which has an active system of slavery in the territory. There were slaves in Utah, there were slaves in New Mexico, but relatively few. But Oklahoma has an active system of slavery, and that slavery is not ended until the 13th Amendment finally abolishes slavery in all of the United States. It's worth remembering that a number of Confederate regiments came out of Oklahoma, and these were mostly Cherokee regiments because the Cherokee, as with the other four, quote, civilized tribes of the Southeast, were slaveholding tribes. So slavery is part of the pre-statehood history of Oklahoma, and racism is embedded in the statehood history. The very first law that Oklahoma passed was an elaborate segregation law passed immediately upon the organization of the first legislature under the new Constitution. The first time that the United States Attorney General intervened in a civil rights case, and a case argued jointly by the U.S. government and the NAACP, was Gwynn versus Oklahoma, which struck down Oklahoma's grandfather clause. In the 1940s and 50s, two of the major desegregation cases setting up for first the integration of Texas Law School in Sweat versus Painter, and then the striking down of segregation in Brown, came out of Oklahoma. The McLaren case and Scipio versus the Oklahoma Law School. So if we look at the history of Oklahoma, it is a segregating state. It was one of the 18 states that, I'm sorry, it was one of the 17 states that had mandatory universal segregation everywhere in the state in 1950. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Oklahomans viewed themselves as being a southern state. It was a southern state. One of the positions that you did not mention in introducing me is that I taught for 7 years at the University of Tulsa. Tulsa is a southern city. It might like to think it's in the West. It isn't. So it shouldn't surprise us that Oklahoma saw the issue of women's suffrage as a question of Southern versus the rest of the country in terms of expanding rights. It is worth noting that of the 17 Southern states, which would include the 15 slave states that existed in 1860 and the two new Southern states of West Virginia and Oklahoma, of those states, only 6 of them ratified women's suffrage at the time it was coming before the United States. The South didn't want women voting because Southerners were, I think, culturally conservative and also tied to race. Yes, there are some progressive aspects of Oklahoma. Oklahoma had a number of socialists in its state legislature before World War I, but it was a radical Southern populism or socialism, and it was always tied to race. Having said that, I have to say that this is a spectacularly interesting and wonderful paper, and it shows the kind of really good work that can be done by getting into the archives and getting our hands dirty and reading lots of correspondence and reading old newspapers and putting it together. I found it a remarkably interesting paper, and it's a great contribution. So the next paper I want to talk about is Silvana's paper on the Midwest. She and I are in very strong agreement that the Midwest is a very complicated place. And as she goes forward with this research, I think she should think about a couple of things. One of the questions she raises is, why did the states ratify the 15th Amendment, but Midwestern states did not change their constitutions? The easiest answer for that is that the states did not ratify the 15th Amendment. The state legislatures ratified. It's a lot easier to get a majority in a state legislature than it is to get a constitutional amendment pushed through a state legislature and then ratified by the general population. As she shows in great detail in the written paper, there are lots of attempts to change state constitutions that fail. And she has this wonderful notion, which I completely agree with, and I will use, and as soon as the paper is published, I can then cite it, the notion that post-Civil War state constitution makers were trying, as she put it, jam into their constitution outdated constitutional concepts, or that the voters were trying to deal with outdated constitutional concepts, such as anti-banking notions that had been part of the Democratic Party. And this explains a great deal. The most interesting one, perhaps, may be the Michigan Constitution, where the traditional historians had said the Michigan Constitution failed because it had black suffrage. But as Martin Hershock, who is at University of Michigan Dearborn, pointed out in a wonderful book on Michigan, the evidence shows just the opposite, that the Republicans who put the suffrage issue on the ballot in Michigan as part of the new Constitution believed that black suffrage would carry the Constitution. It failed not because of black suffrage, it failed because of other things such as banking, such as helping new industries, state aid to railroads, and salaries for state legislatures. So it's a very complicated history. One other thing to consider in looking at the Midwest is the fact that in 1883, the Supreme Court, again living with outdated antebellum notions of constitutional law, struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Following that, every Midwestern state passed its own state Civil Rights Act, protecting blacks, at least in the legal system, in precisely the ways that the 1875 Civil Rights Act had done. This was also true throughout the North. That is, the entire North passes state civil rights laws. These are not always enforced, but as the written paper points out, there are enforcements of it in various states at various times. And one case which is not in this paper because it's a little later, but it illustrates it, is a successful suit by a black in Nebraska when a barber refused to cut his hair. And the Nebraska Supreme Court says, we didn't fight a civil war so people could say, I'm not cutting your hair because you are black. There are a number of cases like this. And so this is a very complicated region in which race is always an issue, but the Midwest, I think, is far more liberal in many ways than historians like Eugene Bernwanger and Leon Litwack told us in the 1960s. And I welcome the kind of research that's going on here because I think it's very important. Now, of course, like the rest of the panel, we move to the Pacific Islands and to the Philippines. Again, this is a wonderful example of what happens when people dive into the archives, dive into letters, do research that other people haven't even thought of. I learned an awful lot from this paper, and Laura, I have to admit that I sent it to a colleague of mine who is a Filipino by birth, because I thought that she's not a historian, but we're working together in other ways, because I thought that this would be something that she ought to read and would want to know about right away. My main thoughts on the paper are two. First, it is important to understand that Philippines are not part of the United States, as Laura said in her verbal paper. The Philippines are a possession, a trust territory, a trusteeship, but we don't incorporate the Philippines the way we had previously incorporated conquered territories, such as the area we got from Mexico after the Mexican War, or the Gadsden Purchase, which we bought, or Alaska, which we bought, or Louisiana, which we bought. After the Spanish-American War, the United States is faced with a true overseas empire and really does not know what to do with it. And in part, of course, this is because of race. All of these places that we have acquired are populated by non-whites, and America in 1899 is not ready to face the possibility that there would be a significant number of non-white members of Congress, members of the Senate. It is worth remembering, of course, that Hawaii is the 50th state. And why is Hawaii's citizenship held up when it had a population to be a state? Because Southerners in Congress were deathly afraid that people of Chinese, Japanese, and Pacific Island ancestry and Filipino ancestry would end up in Congress, as in fact they did. So racism permeates how we deal with the territories. The other piece of the paper, which is in written form, and I hope this is published soon so people can read it, illustrates the complexity of white women's suffrage activists in the U.S. Because while they are in favor of women's suffrage for themselves, there is clearly a gigantic split within the suffrage movement over non-white suffrage. And the leaders of the suffrage movement, at least some of them, including Carrie Chapman Cat, do not look nearly as heroic when we see their comments about the possibility of white and Filipino women voting. And there are other women's suffrage activists who, again, denounce the very idea that Filipino women should be allowed to vote. So there is sisterhood, but it is mostly, sadly, it is racially confined. So let me stop there because the audience has been very patient, and turn this over to the audience to ask us questions or to the panelists to respond to my comments.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those comments. Yes, if our panelists would like to rejoin by turning their cameras back on, they now have an opportunity to respond to the comments, if they so choose.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start since I was the first one up. So I think there's a couple of things I would say. I don't think so much that first of all, thank you, Paul, for your excellent comments, and I truly appreciate them. I think in terms of drinking the Kool-Aid, kind of, not really though.
They served it a lot when I lived in Tulsa. We got a lot of Kool-Aid on things like the race riot that never happened.
Oh no! That's absolutely true.
And one more thing, it was a very active Klan in Oklahoma.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. That's not something that I have necessarily bought into. So I do want to make that clear.
Okay.
In terms of this identity issue, though, Senate Bill 1, which is the first law passed, as you stated, by the Oklahoma State Senate. These are all things that I was aware of, and certainly do acknowledge and agree with. But if we're going to make that, of course, the central issue about race, then it might get a little tricky, especially with Oklahoma going back to the days of Indian Territory and the Civil War. When we talk about Native people's involvement in the Civil War, particularly on the side of the Confederacy, if you talk to the Cherokee tribes or any of the southeastern tribes, they don't identify themselves as Southern. They identify themselves by their tribes, right? So for them, while they
and they don't, at least the Cherokee, do not recognize the descendants of their own slaves who were intermarried with Cherokee as being members of the Cherokee Nation. And
right.
a friend of mine was actually defeated when she ran for the president of the Cherokee Nation because as Attorney General, she had ruled the Cherokee freedmen were part of the Cherokee Nation.
And I understand that, but I do want to.
It's complicated.
Right. And that's what I want to emphasize. I want to emphasize this whole idea of the Southern identity, that it's much more complicated than just being Southern. That's the emphasis here. This whole idea of being a Southerner is not what's happening in Oklahoma. Because here in Oklahoma, there is this push, even present day, that we are a Southern state. But what I've learned and understood is that it's much more complicated than that. And that's what I was surprised by when I was reading these primary sources from this time period, is that even as early on as back then, that there's even back then this early push of embracing this completely Southern identity. That's what took me by surprise. Because again, it's far more complicated than just being Southern. And a lot of what complicates that is the issue of race, the presence of Native peoples, the presence of Black Americans, the presence of white Americans, and all of these people with their different political ideologies complicates all of those things. And that's where my commentary came in. It wasn't the belief that there was no Southern influence or there wasn't a complete embracing of or a rejection of Southern identity. That's not what I meant by that. So I just
I'm sorry if I misunderstood you.
No. That's so I just wanted to clear that up. Yeah.
Okay, I guess since I was up next, first of all, thank you for that comment. You're absolutely right, and that's why we need commentators. That was sloppy writing on my part, so thank you, and I will have a chance to fix that before it goes to press. I mean, the business about the fact that state citizens don't ratify a constitutional amendments, the legislatures do. In some of these states, they do, there are editorials in the newspapers about, you got to vote for this guy because he's going to do this and that. But you're absolutely right about that. I'm really fascinated by what you said about the Civil Rights Act of 1875. I hadn't thought about that. And I think, it's not so relevant today's. Well, what I want to say is it's extremely relevant to some things that are going on in our national legislature right now. And it is really worth thinking about some more. I wonder if you'd write an editorial for the New York Times on that subject.
Well, I would love to write an editorial for the New York Times whenever they want to publish it. My first one actually was a first editorial in the New York Times had a St. Louis connection because it was an editorial about who owned the last baseball hit back to the pitcher when the Red Sox beat the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series. And the Red Sox first baseman pocketed the ball and then tried to sell it on eBay. And the New York Times came to me and said, would you write an editorial on this? And I said that actually, since it was a home game in St. Louis, the ball belonged to the St. Louis Cardinals. And there was a very nice editorial in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch praising me for that. And of course, as might be expected, I got nasty hate mail from people in Boston, all of which I was living in Oklahoma at the time, all of which said, "You must be a Yankees fan." That would be their first line. And then telling me, "Why are you trying to take our ball from us?" But the fact is it would be great to talk about this in editorial. It's just hard to do. I did send you a piece though that details.
Actually, Paul, you forgot to attach it. So if you wouldn't
I will attach it again. I'm sorry. I thought I attached it. I will send it again.
Thanks.
Sure.
I'll be really quick because I know we want to get to some Q&A, but thank you from me also, Paul, for your comments and your encouragement. Yes, I mean, race and racial perceptions and racism absolutely undergird all of what I was writing. In a way, it was a struggle for me to figure out how to put it into my paper because Sofia de Vera and also other Filipina suffragists, when they were talking and when they were publishing articles themselves, the Filipina suffrage movement didn't really explicitly address race. But when she came to the United States, she obviously had to confront that directly. And of course, you're right. I mean, the Philippines was always theoretically on a path to national sovereignty from 1899 onwards. It's that racist perceptions of Filipinos as being unready for democracy was determining the timeline. They had to be granted it by those who would decide at which point they were prepared for it. So it's really a lot of her publicity campaign or her cultural ambassadorship that was arguing for sovereignty was about needing to overcome, help the American public realize that their racial perceptions of Filipinos were wrong. So that's really the main front on which she was fighting for suffrage rights for herself and self-determination for other Filipinos. Thanks.
All right. We do have several questions here. Some of them are addressed specifically to individual panelists. If we do not have an opportunity to get to all of those, I will send them along to the panelists after the program, and maybe we can continue the conversation via email with the question writers. But there is one that I think all of you might be able to address. It was stated that in the U.S. suffrage, suffrage is fundamentally a feature of citizenship. But is it? Weren't the suffragists protesting immigrant men's access to the franchise? So how does the history of alien suffrage in the U.S. intersect with the stories that you trace?
Well, since nobody wants to jump on this, I will at least start it off, since obviously all of us think a lot about suffrage. Suffrage in the early national period was never tied to citizenship, and suffrage was very complicated. There were, of course, many, many citizens who could never vote. Women were citizens. They were both citizens of their states and the United States. They could get a passport, for example, which could only be given to a citizen. But of course, they were not allowed to vote. On the other hand, at various times in our history, well into the late 19th and early 20th century, immigrants who had declared their intention to be citizens were allowed to vote under state law without regard to whether they'd actually become a citizen. The really interesting thing is suffrage, until the passage of the 15th Amendment, is entirely regulated by state law. Even the 14th Amendment, which attempted to force the South to enfranchise blacks, only did it in a backhanded way by saying, if you don't enfranchise black men on the same basis as white men, we're going to cut your congressional representation. And of course, the former Confederate states would have said, fine, we'd much rather have fewer members of Congress than have to allow black people to vote. So up until the 15th Amendment, there were no federal laws regulating suffrage. Then the 19th Amendment is a second federal thing, but really not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 do you get a full-blown federal intervention in support of voting. And as I said, into the 20th century, non-citizens were allowed to vote. Immigrants were allowed to vote. I can't speak on whether the advocates of the 19th Amendment would have been where they stood on that, because I think by the time of the 19th Amendment, most states had moved to only allowing citizens to vote. But I'm not 100% sure of that.
So, Kid, I can respond. In the source that I used early on in my presentation, the editorial written by S.P. Freeling, one of the things that he mentions, in addition to the fear of black men and, of course, black women voting, is the fear that there will be this huge influx of the immigrant vote. This is something that I've come across quite a bit in my research before, but this idea that it would be tied to both the 19th and the 15th Amendments, I had not seen that before, and to see it in this particular editorial was really interesting. And he specifically pointed to New York, and he said, New York has been overrun with foreigners. The foreign vote has taken over New York. And is that what you want to see here in Oklahoma? Okay. So he makes this argument that if you allow the ratification of this amendment, if we push this forward, this is exactly what's going to happen. The immigrants are going to take over Oklahoma, and the combination of the immigrant vote as well as the black vote will completely destroy the state that we know. And so it's this, so he portrays this as this great threat that will change not only the Oklahoman identity, but the American identity.
Right. Thank you very much. We have more questions coming in. Again, individual questions will go to the panelists. This one, though, for all of you. So much of the history of women's suffrage and the Centennial celebrations have focused on white women. How do you think integrating the issue of race and the involvement of women of color challenges or revises our understanding of the suffrage movement?
Start that one. Thank you for that great question. It was the upcoming Centennial that first put the thought in my head to work on this topic more explicitly. And I feel there's two levels of value. I mean, the first one, and the one I've heard most often in public discussions around the 19th Amendment lately, has been a recognition of how white American suffragists had racist ideas and used racist rhetoric and tactics to try to gain the vote. And I think it's very important to recognize the limits and maybe not have too many heroes. It's dangerous to have heroes. They invariably disappoint us in one way or another. So to push for, more critical understanding, more of marking anniversaries than celebrating them necessarily. But I think on another level too, and what I'd love to see more of as we go forward is a recognition of how women of color participated in suffrage movements themselves also, right? That the exclusionary tactics are not the sum total of that movement. I'm thinking obviously of Martha Jones's new book, Vanguard. I think that attention to race helps us put the whole suffrage question into broader categories, as a type of civil rights movement, and that maybe reducing it to calling women's suffrage is too narrow. If we take the point of view, if we center women of color in it, we see it much more in a continuum of civil rights. And like this conference, right, connecting the 19th Amendment to the 15th Amendment, I think it's that consciousness of race that has led to more connections and other things. And that will make it maybe harder to put it in the US history textbook as this little sidebar, little interruption from the general narrative, and instead of, something that was connected to much broader issues and a broader timeline before and after 1920.
The question is, so much of history of women's suffrage and the centennial celebrations have focused on white women. How do you think integrating the issue of race and involvement of women of color challenges or revises our understanding of the suffrage movement?
Yes. Well, this is actually kind of a horrible story in the time and the place that I'm researching. The assumption always was that suffrage at most would only extend to Black men, and even there were lots of proposals about possibly asking for literacy tests and other kinds of things. But Black women are written right out of this history. In fact, the few times that I've found, and I've looked at every single state constitutional convention debate, from the moment they began to be published until about 1900, and I've only ever found 2 references to Black women's civil rights, and they are really ugly, and so ugly, in fact, that I don't even want to, I can't even repeat them here. There was profound contempt toward Black women in these state constitutional debates, and the best that could be hoped for from some of these discussions was that they would be tolerated and that they would be permitted to go on living in the region. There's no discussion about their rights whatsoever. And I have to say, I'm a 19th century historian, so I haven't taken this research past about 1900. And I wish I could speak to that, but that's outside my field.
Sunu, you get the last word.
Well, I was just going to say, Laura had really said everything that I was going to say. If we can view women of color as active participants as opposed to passive participants, women on the sidelines who were just there and things being done to them, as opposed to women who were actively involved in the movement in their own way. If we can just change the narrative, I think we better understand the suffrage movement, and we have a better understanding of what suffrage and political activism mean for them as well. And I think that's just a better understanding of inclusivity in a new way.
If I could, if we're talking for the moment about only white women, I mean, white women were quite active in the 1840s and 50s, as you know, in women's suffrage movements in the Middle West. And I did find some interesting descriptions of women who attended some of these constitutional conventions. And there was some suggestion that the men in the hall were playing to the galleries and trying to impress women with their positive statements about women's role in society. So there is some of that. None of the, somebody asked a question about Ohio in 1850 and 51, and yeah, there was quite a bit of debate there about women's suffrage. And even after it failed. Even after the Civil War in the 1870s, as these debates over women's suffrage come up again, and again, I have to say, they really were talking about white women. There was one constitutional convention where a proposal to discuss and to put women's suffrage rights on the agenda lost by only 5 votes. So take that for what it's worth.
And thank you to our panelists and to our commenter for joining us today to be part of this conference. The conference continues tomorrow afternoon, Thursday, October 15th. We're starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time with 4 papers looking at the topic. The panel is titled, "Is She Disqualified from Voting?" So various ways in which these arguments have come up, looking at old age, military service, the development of patents, and disability. So some great papers coming up tomorrow. We hope you will join us. And again, thank you to our panelists for this wonderful and insightful gathering this afternoon. And thank you to our attendees for tuning in. We hope you'll join us tomorrow afternoon and also on Friday. So on behalf of the MHS, have a wonderful rest of your day.